Hi, HRN listeners. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we have a really fun campaign and an ask for you. This 15th anniversary tour is aiming to bring you closer to unique food and music experiences in some of the most exciting cities in America. All the while, we're raising funds to support our work empowering the next generation of food systems storytellers through our fellowship programs. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and be entered into a raffle in the city of your choice to win a dinner for two at a noteworthy restaurant and tickets for two to a concert at a prominent local venue. We have incredible partners in New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Asheville, and Ardmore, Pennsylvania, who have donated a meal for two and two tickets to a concert of the winner's choice. And all donations help fund our fellowship programs, where we're helping to build essential workforce readiness skills and food system storytelling skills. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We do more varieties and flavors of cheese than anywhere else on Earth. By pushing the boundaries of what cheese can and should be, find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. This is Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021, and we've got some great guests. I think we're going to start by having them introduce themselves, because we're going to talk a little about Jack Kerouac and working class clubs and drinking beer. So let's start with Gerard. Just everyone go around, say their name and, how we know you.
Hey there, my name is Gerard Fagerberg. I'm a freelance beer writer, most often for Good Beer Hunting and The Takeout, and I'm here today to talk about a story that I published in June about Jack Kerouac and craft beer culture. All
right. Pete?
Yeah, I'm Pete Brown. I'm a beer writer from England, and that's where I am just now in London. I first met you guys when I was over in New York researching a book about the ingredients of beer. And at the moment, I'm writing a book about working men's clubs in Britain and the unique institution that they are.
Great. BR?
BR Rolia, formerly of Shelton Brothers Importers, and now just doing general beer things.
And one of our top guests ever.
And a frequent guest.
Frequent guest.
Happy to be here.
And PJ?
I'd to follow up with that. I'm PJ Mercier from Navigation Brewing Company in Lowell, Massachusetts. Owner, operator, and everything above.
All right, and home of Jack Kerouac. So let's start. Gerard, so when I saw your article, tell us why you wrote about Jack Kerouac for Good Beer Hunting. And, is that a beer article?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is I was thinking about this. I don't think there's anywhere else that would have run that article because of how literature focused it was. Actually, my first draft was basically like a biography almost. So yeah, I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm from the South Shore, and my brother actually lives in Lowell now. He's a frequent patron of Navigation Brewing, but I started reading Kerouac in college. And I loved it. I was, really entranced by it. There's a story I tell in the article about how it first came to me. It was introduced by a friend. And I kind of put it away for a while, but now I have a 16-month-old daughter. And, one morning we were sitting by the bookshelf and she pulled a book off the shelf. And it was a Kerouac book, a Satori in Paris, and one of his books I had never read. And I was like, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll read this book. And I read it. And in the book, he's just like this drunken buffoon idiot. It's like such a humbling moment for me. So it really thrust me back into reconsidering Kerouac and like my own history with alcohol. I come from an alcoholic Massachusetts family, so it's all kind of tied in there. And I thankfully had a very kind editor, Claire Bullen, who was happy to take me on the journey to make it a beer story.
All right. And then, so you were connected with PJ. So he was one of the guests you wanted to bring on. Why did you want to talk to PJ about this show tonight?
Well, PJ was one of the first people I reached out to for the article because Navigation is one of a few craft breweries that are actually in Lowell. And, like I said, my brother lives in Lowell. I've been to Navigation a few times. Also Merrimack Artisan Ale is another company that's close by. And I thought, why not start with the place that Kerouac was from, and to look at how his influence reverberates today and really how that enmeshes with the craft beer scene. So I did talk to PJ for the story. I don't think he made it in as a quote, but he had one of his beer tenders, Dan Iverson, it talked to me, and it was, I think, the thing that really made the piece solidify, getting that perspective of what it's like to be working in the beer industry and to be a fan, really a devotee of Jack Kerouac, and to have to confront this idea of like how destructive the alcoholism is, and how do we celebrate this, and how do we do it responsibly, and how does it fit with the way that craft beer is supposed to be consumed.
Yeah. And then, PJ, just give us a little intro. Tell us about Navigation Brewery. And where is Lowell, Mass? I mean, there's this myth, and a part of this show is about myth. And there's this myth of Kerouac, and you always hear he's from Lowell. But where is Lowell?
So Lowell, Massachusetts is about 35 minutes northwest of Boston. We're right on the New Hampshire border. We're about a city of about 100, and I think there's a little over 100,000. It's actually the fourth largest city in Massachusetts, and also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And Navigation is just a small part of that. We're a small craft brewery. We're a 7-barrel brew house. So we're constantly brewing new beers, and just more of a neighborhood type place for the community to come in and hang out.
Yeah, what I love about Navigation is where you are too. You're in those artist lofts too. So you're among all these artist studios just in the bottom floor of that.
Yeah, we're housed in a place called Western Avenue Studios, and there is 17 loft studios that live on site. I think that's 17 or 20 in that range, but there's 250 artist studios in the building that we're in. It was an old mill that was an old Joan Fabric Company mill that was refurbished into art studios.
Yeah. And then BR, you're pretty well read and well traveled. We've talked a lot about working beers.
I'm so well read that I've got my book with me.
I recognize that name on the cover.
Yeah. And anything to say about Jack Kerouac or some of the beers of Belgium that that working people might have been drinking?
Well, I mean, for Jack Kerouac, I read the Good Beer Hunting article, and I realized it's been years, probably since college, since I've actually read any Kerouac, and need to revisit that now. But certainly, I mean, many beers were working class beers. I mean, you look at the Grisette of Belgium, the Saison, the Bière de Garde of Belgium and France, specifically brewed for workers as opposed to just as a social drink, but evolved to a social drink as well. But I mean, there's definitely there's always the myth of the farmhand, but it is based in reality of a lot of these beers, lower ABV because you couldn't drink the water, sort of thing. But don't really have the connection between the European beers and Kerouac, except the fact that I believe his family's from France, I think, originally.
Quebec.
Oh, Quebec. Okay.
Yeah. And then
maybe France before that.
Yeah, maybe France, right?
Most likely, yeah.
And let's go to Pete, because we're trying to tie this in. I think the overall theme for me is myths of working class people, and you're onto a book that is starting to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, so I think working class in the UK means something different than it does in the States. I think a lot of people in the States who would describe themselves as middle class would describe themselves as working class in the UK. Just after Brexit happened, about 60% of the UK population described themselves as working class, even though you would look at their circumstances, their jobs, and a lot of them you'd say, well, they're middle class. And obviously Britain is is obsessed still by the kind of whole class system which we invented. And I come from a very working class blue collar area in the north of England, a place called Barnsley, which was the absolute heart of coal mining. And in communities like that, hard drinking was the rule of the day, really. Partly it was necessary. I've just found this great passage about a club in Barnsley where the barman was pouring pints at 10 to 12 and put 100 pints out on the bar. And this guy sitting there thinks this guy's lost his mind. And then at 12 o'clock, 100 miners come in and with black faces from the soot and the dirt. And they each just kind of sink this pint in about 4 or 5 seconds to clear their throats of the dust and the coal, and then they all leave again. And about 2 or 3 of them stay for a second pint. And so this was part of my upbringing. It's a scene which has all but disappeared now. All the coal mines are closed. There was also kind of mill towns in the north, steel towns, and they're all gone as well. And I know that you've got similar areas in the States that were kind of these big industrial areas, these big blue collar areas, and the clubs were formed mainly by working men. Spaces that were originally intended to be kind of self-improving, and they were meant to be temperance places that didn't have beer. But without beer, the working men wouldn't go to them. So they eventually, very quickly, they realized that they had to have beer to get these guys into educate them. They said working men should be able to kind of rule these places themselves. It should be democratic. They should decide what goes. But the people saying that wanted to impose a middle-class sensibility onto working men. So when the working men did take over, they turned them into kind of places with cheap beer for relaxation. But it does pick up on a couple of the themes that we've already heard. Clubs were seen as a more responsible drinking environment than pubs were, because they weren't driven by a commercial imperative. And it was very tied up with the Industrial Revolution, like Lowell. You know, it's this place where these places where it was about this kind of sudden shock of moving from the land and moving from rural agricultural work to being kind of chained to these big machines, and that was a huge trauma in terms of working class leisure time and how people coped with that. So it's a sprawling, epic history of working people in the UK.
Yeah. Hey, Gerard, in your article, that brings us to Kerouac, because you said that before he was famous, he was drinking beer and he would have a beer glow. And then once he was famous, he was a whiskey drunk.
That insight comes from Jerry Nicosia, who's one of Kerouac's biographers. And I think he talks a lot about Kerouac's relationship with alcohol. I mean, Kerouac's father was an alcoholic, and so he was always drinking. But early in his life, he was drinking a lot of beer and a lot of wine. Actually, Jerry shared me this great picture of Kerouac and one of his friends in New York City after a softball game, and they're drinking ice cold cans of Ballantine beer because, like, for him, that was like ultimate relaxation, right? We're just going to have a couple of beers and relax. But as he became more famous, people were forcing alcohol on him. They'd see him out, they'd buy him drinks. And that is, according to Jerry Nicosia, kind of what started his downfall. But I do also think it's the trajectory of most alcoholics, right? You sort of start with beer, and then, you can't quite scratch that same itch, and you end up, drinking whiskey at 9 o'clock in the morning until you're doubling over and going to the hospital. And, Jerry told me that by the end of his life, Kerouac was only drinking beer as a chaser for whiskey. So that's kind of how his relationship changed over the course of his life.
Yeah. PJ, you want to say anything about like the myth of Kerouac and Lowell? I always thought it was kind of romantic thinking about this working class kid going to an Ivy League school and traveling the world as a poet. I don't know, what do people go to Lowell looking for?
Well, I know a lot of people go and they visit. They read his stuff, they're intrigued by it, so they go to visit. His gravesite's a big one. People always leaving bottles of whiskey out there. You'll see, you can find pictures of that on the internet anywhere you want to look. I mean, we had so my grandfather was a political man in Lowell. He was city councilor, and he would always talk about Kerouac stories. And essentially, what we kind of grew up, what he knew him as was he was a drunk. He would hang out in a bunch of the different bars. He had, he definitely, I mean, a lot of people have a hard time with alcohol. He had a hard time with it and his struggles like anybody else, I guess. But that's all, that's from the locals' perspective. There's really not much other than, it's just a guy from Lowell. We don't see much of it. You see a lot of the tourists will come in and really soak it all up. Like some of the places that he had been, was it the Worthen, I believe it was, Jared? The Worthen. It'll take you back in time if you go in there too. But that's pretty much all, the folklore that we hear about it, and that this guy got to travel the world, and he was just another guy from Lowell. Really, that's all it was for the Lowell people. And until he became famous, then it was like, oh yeah, Jack Kerouac.
Yeah, one of the things that's crazy about Kerouac is he died destitute, right? And he had $90 to his name, and now he's the only writer with every single one of their books currently in print. So much of his fame came after the fact. Like when he was living in Lowell later in life with his mother, he was a bum. That's all he was, and he had alienated everyone in his life from him, and everywhere he lived, whether it was New York or Florida or Massachusetts, people knew him as this hunched over sack at the bar.
That's pretty much it.
Cool. Yeah, man. Well, I don't know if I want to talk about this anymore. Well, Pete, let's go back to your book, because there's some redemption in these clubs that you were talking about, right? Because I do feel that, like, let's go back to what you said about the Industrial Revolution. Like when BR was talking about, some of the low ABV beers of farm workers and history, going to these industrial towns really was a big shift for populations, right?
Yeah, and we think about the Industrial Revolution happening over a period of maybe 2 centuries, but there was a point in the early 19th century where basically a mass of people moved from agricultural work to urban factory and mill work in the UK, and it was a shock. It took a while for society and culture to rebuild itself, to reorient itself. So when people working in fields, that very much that kind of that Belgian, that saison experience that we hear about, it was like that in the UK up to maybe around 1800, and families worked together. You worked really hard at harvest time and planting time, and then when there was no work to do, you kind of took it easy. The year was a cycle rather than a kind of linear progression of years. And then in the factory, you were part of a production line, and you were yoked together. The men were all in large groups of men. Women either kept the house or they worked in domestic service for the richer landowners in the big houses. And leisure time kind of disappeared. And every single leisure pursuit that people tried to bring in from the countryside was banned. Access to open space was banned. Slums were built over parks, that kind of thing. And there was nowhere else to go other than the pub and the music hall. That was it. And so culture became more oriented around drinking, around going to the pub and drinking. And it was demonized. In the mid 19th century, we were kind of teetering on a sort of religious fundamentalist version of Christianity, where everything was bad, everything was wrong, everything was a sin, and so drinking was a sin, and all this kind of thing. But some pubs were pubs that, the way we idealise the British pub, some pubs are kind of warm welcome, nice and cheery, people sitting there by the fire, just having a couple of beers and passing the time. Other pubs turned into gin palaces. And again, you got this kind of thing that we've already talked about, the dichotomy between beer and spirits. And when people were drinking gin, they were drinking to self-destruct. They were drinking to blot out the horrible reality of industrial work. When people were drinking beer, a lot of the time they were just more mellow, just relaxing. It was an aid to just socializing and chilling out. And what I'm finding as I read a lot of this stuff is that people just wanted to hang out. That's all they wanted to do. And a couple of beers made it easier to hang out. And more pleasant to hang out, and that's why I'm a beer writer, because I still believe that. But when we got to this, it's a bit too simplistic to say it's black and white. But spirits tended to be much more destructive, and so you get those things fighting for supremacy through the 19th century.
Wow. Hey Gerard, I wanted to also interview you just personally because I just got to meet you through this article. Just tell us about some of the beers that you like. I mean, first of all, that you're a good beer hunting writer is pretty cool. How did you start writing for them? And do you write about other things besides beer?
I write mainly about beer. I mean, my journey into beer writing was really kind of a silly one. You know, I've always wanted to be a music writer, and I was doing that for a little bit. You know, I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts before I moved here, and I was writing for the Dig, which was the all weekly there, still there actually, and moved out here, and I moved into such a great beer culture at the time in 2014. It was really, really growing here in Minneapolis, and it was an area that not a lot of people had covered yet because of that fact. So I just kind of got into the business side of things, and obviously I enjoyed beer, and so I really enjoyed being kind of a part of that history and trying to document it in our local papers. What was City Pages and now is Racket, and yeah, I love the creativity here. I'm doing a feature right now on a brewery called Junkyard, which is in Moorhead. Which is right on the North Dakota border in Northwest Minnesota. Really fun, fantastic beers. I'm drinking one from Lupulin in Big Lake right now, which is another kind of far off outpost. So I just it feels a little bit more like a frontier here. So I love being part of that, and I'm lucky when I get to write about it for Good Beer Hunting. You know, I just had kind of gotten a hand from someone I know through Twitter, Kate Bernat, who is, if anyone reads anything in craft beer, you should read her first. And she said, go ahead and pitch this story. And there was another story before that I written about the evolution of prohibition in the United States, and Minnesota, who has the most regressive beer laws, I would say, in America. And so I've enjoyed that. And sometimes I write about other wacky food stuff for the takeout, but that's kind of the meat and potatoes of it. You know, when you have a 16-month-old daughter, you do a lot of that too. So,
yeah. Well, you gave me a cool list of beers that you liked. You said 6 beers you enjoyed recently. You said Prize, East Lake, By All Means, Lucky Envelope, New Realm.
Yeah.
Are those all from near you, or where are those breweries?
East Lake is probably the closest brewer to me, which is great. It's about 4 blocks away, and they're a little tiny, five-ish barrel brewery in a global market near me. I think they're super underrated, so I definitely wanted to give them a shout out on the national stage. One of those beers was sent to me by Kate from Montana. It was fantastic. And then I have a coworker who's in Charlottesville, Virginia, who sent me 2 beers from New Realm. That was my first time ever having anything from New Realm, and man, they were fantastic. The Hellas was so crisp, clean, and then the other beer he sent me was like a black tea and lemonade sour, which was it's like an Arnold Palmer. It was really, and so New Realm quickly elevated to being one of my favorite breweries in Virginia, in the DMV for sure. So yeah, I'm lucky that I get to taste a lot of beers from out of state, but I usually only drink Minnesota beer.
Oh man, Minnesota pride. Well, last year with all the news, the first time I really paid attention to Minneapolis and Minnesota, I think since who was the governor of Minnesota, who was a former wrestler?
Jesse Ventura. Yeah, that was long before my time.
that was the first thing I knew about Minnesota, and then last year I knew about that there was a pretty progressive city.
Yeah, I live about 2 blocks from George Floyd Square, so yeah, it's been a crazy year, but luckily I got to vote today for a charter amendment that's hopefully going to bring a lot of positive social change in the city going forward.
Wow, Minneapolis, isn't that where what was the TV star from the 60s? Wasn't there a TV show based there?
Yeah,
Mary Tyler Moore.
Yeah, there's a statue of her in downtown. Yeah, throwing the hat in the freeze frame. Yeah.
Wow, a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Hey, and so Pete, what do you make of all this?
Well, I'm fascinated by the Kerouac thing, because like everybody, I read him in college, and it was this kind of big opening up of the world, really. That sense of wonder when you haven't really experienced much, and maybe it kind of gets tarnished in time. But it strikes me as that I come from an alcoholic family as well, and we when we work in beer, we have this pull towards both ends of the spectrum. There is a joy in hedonism and in losing it and just abdicating your responsibility for anything. And obviously that's fine in small doses. But if it becomes your default, then you get into trouble. And I think a lot of people I know in the industry have had problems with alcohol. And I have to be careful myself. I take a month off every January just to make sure that I still can, and that I don't suffer any adverse effects. As soon as that becomes difficult, then I have to think about doing something more serious. But at the moment, it's still fine. And it's that relationship between creativity and alcohol, which we explore in a lot of writers. A lot of people cite Hemingway as somebody as well who had that glorious kind of drunken epiphany. And actually, Hemingway was not a fan of writing while drunk. He would often write he would often stay strictly sober while he was writing, because he felt that it couldn't mix. So I do think that the relationship between creativity and alcohol is a fascinating one. So I'm loving learning more about Kerouac.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. That so much of the conversation I had with Haymarket Brewing in Illinois, in Michigan, so much of that had to do with that relationship between creativity and alcohol. And I love the Hemingway relation here, because Hemingway and Kerouac could not have been more different, but also in a lot of ways it could not have been more the same, right? I think they're so diametrically opposed yet so united by this thing. And as a writer, and I'm sure you know this, Pete, you have to constantly evaluate what is your relationship with alcohol, because of the things that were fed in terms of this is the thing that will help you open the door. And that's something I had to contend with a lot in my life.
Yeah, I did a controlled experiment when I was writing my craft book. I had writer's block, and I spent a night with a bottle of whiskey. And as an experiment, I drank a bottle of whiskey and carried on writing till 4 a.m. And I normally, when I do that, I can't read my writing the next day. So I was really careful to just spend 10 times more time correcting my typing than I spent actually writing it. And at the time I was doing it, I was thinking, oh, this is amazing stuff. I'm really into some really deep shit here. And the next morning, I'd say there were 2 or 3 sentences that I would not have got to if I hadn't done that. I did reach out to something that I couldn't have done sober, but the rest of it was awful. It was really bad. And so I think alcohol does give you that illusion of this, oh my God, man, this is incredible. This is incredible. And on my experience, let's just say I've not done it again.
I mostly just want to go to sleep when I get drunk. So.
Well, it's a rush of any creative thing, where you're whether it's a hit of, used to be a cigarette sometimes, or having that cup of coffee or an extra drink, it pushes you through sometimes, but you also can't do that every day. PJ, back to you with your beer, man. Well, first I keep thinking about some things you mentioned in the article, Gerard, about this travel in Ulysses. And I was reading a wine article this week, and actually in the restaurant, they were describing their wine list as Odysseus's journey or something. So there are these travel. So it's cool to talk about Minneapolis and London and now back to Lowell. So let's pretend we're Kerouac bouncing around. PJ, tell us about some of the beers you make, man. And what are we keeping you from? Because I know that you got a brew pub, you have a tasting room. Tell us what it's like, because I have a feeling we're going to come up and visit you in Lowell.
Oh, that would be great. I'd love to have you. So yeah, we're a 7-barrel brew house, and we're constantly brewing new stuff. We brew everything all over the board. I mean, my tap list right now is not like most tap lists. A lot of places you go, there's probably going to be about a dozen IPAs on, and then a couple other beers. Right now we have we brew a Kolsch. That's actually what I was drinking earlier. We have an amber on tap. We have a we call something. It's actually it's a brown ale with coffee. We used coffee, cocoa nibs in that one. We got a sour. It literally tastes like a lemonade. Like a lemonade. It is unbelievable. Anyway, yeah, we brew everything. We brew all over the board. I think we're well over 200 beers now, different types of styles, different types of beers that we've brewed. You name the style, we'll do it. We kind of specialize in some German stuff. Some of our darker stuff is really, really good. A lot of the porters, a lot of stouts. And like everybody else, we do a lot of IPAs. We prefer to do West Coast IPAs, American Pale Ales. It really just, we try to have something for everybody's palate. So when they come in, they are always trying something new. But we're trying to convert some people over. I think most breweries are trying to do that. And thankfully, lagers and some of the other pilsners are starting to make a comeback, which is easy for us to obviously brew. But it's also helping converting people over from those. I just call it the 30-pack drinkers. I think we all know them. They could put down a 30-pack of Coors Light, but then you hand them a 7% IPA and you tell them, that's a 6-pack and have at it. And I'm only going to pour you one more because they don't know how to handle it.
And you're right, man. That there's still the average person isn't the bulk of beer sales is still like kind of mainstream, like I guess you call it 30-pack drinkers, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Because that's what we call them.
I think it's so interesting. Minneapolis and Lowell are so similar, both former textile milling towns coming through the city, but also you have like that up and coming young class of folks. Like it's changed so much since my childhood. Like when I was like a teenager, it was like never go there, and I go to visit my brother, and it's like a fun, the up and coming town. So how has like the beer taste changed in the time that you guys have been operating? Well, has it like become more like, I don't know, educated, if that's the word you want to use?
I was a little bit broken up there, but I think I got most of it. So we're trying to educate people, because we're not, we're one of two breweries that are in the city. And again, Lowell is a blue collar city. So you have a lot of working people who are going to the bars. I can imagine it's very similar to what Pete described earlier. I don't think much has changed. Maybe a few more nightclubs. The beer has gotten better. We're probably not drinking common ales like they were back then. But the scene's good. You're trying to build a community around, trying to introduce people to it, and like Pete kind of elaborated. I'll tag on to that. It's about responsible drinking, going there, having a good time, just wanting to hang out. We're not looking, we close early. We're closed at 10 o'clock. We don't want that late night crowd coming in. I don't think most breweries or tap rooms want that anyway. I think, we want to keep people coming back, but we don't want them to be relying on us, to the point that we become the go-to bar. That we don't want to turn into dive bars. So that's why we're constantly changing our beers all the time, trying to keep everything fresh, keeping people coming. You'll have a lot of people that will follow on social media. We brewed today. We brewed one of our kind of our go-tos. We brew it a couple times a year. It's called the Black Pepper Porter, and that's going to bring a whole different crowd of people who haven't had that beer in a while. They're going to come back in and they're going to want to try that, and because they haven't had it in a while. And then we'll while we got them here, we'll have them try some of the other stuff that they missed over the few months or 2 months that the tap list has changed. That answered your question, Jared. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Hey, back to Pete. Pete, back to the working clubs. Why did you start thinking about that book? I don't think I'd ever even heard of working clubs before you were talking about it recently.
Yeah, it's a funny one. It's part of my upbringing. I've just been writing a chapter about how when I was a kid, when I was not a kid, after my first year at university, I went back home and got a job in a workingmen's club 100 yards from the house where I grew up. And when they found out I was a student, they fired me because my face didn't fit anymore, and it's part of a complex relationship. Me working out my relationship with being a working class person who's become a middle class writer. I rejected my community that I grew up in, and it rejected me. So that's part of it. I think the other side of it is that the working class is always demonized. They're always kind of considered to be kind of brutish, and these are people who just go out drinking, and they're quite thuggish and that kind of stuff. And that's an unfair characterization. I think working class communities had a history of being really strong and cohesive, and there was a lot of goodness in there, and it's now being broken up. But what I love it about it is I mean, I wanted to write this for about 15 years. When I wrote my first book, Man Walks Into a Pub, there was a Licensing Act in 1872 that imposed lots of new closing restrictions on pubs, but allowed the gentlemen's clubs in the middle of London, where the aristocracy drank, they were exempt from these restrictions. And then the guys running the workingmen's clubs went, okay, so these restrictions apply to pubs, but not to clubs. And it's like, well, yeah. So, well, we're clubs as well. So we can stay open and drink as late as the aristocracy and the politicians can. And the aristocracy and the politicians went, shit, we screwed this up. And I just love that example of the working men turning the hypocrisy of the establishment back on itself and winning that battle. And the upper classes have always tried to kind of improve the working classes and say, this is what you should be doing, this is what you should be reading, this is what you should be listening to, this is what you should be doing with your spare time. And working class people have always turned that back around and said, yeah, well, this is the way we want to do it. And so it's really a story about that. And it really is a very unique, other countries, I think Canada had some working men's clubs, I think Australia definitely did. But at its peak in the UK, something like 20% of the population belonged to a working men's club. It was an incredibly influential organization. It wasn't just about cheap beer. It was about self-actualization. So you could be working down a mine or working in a mill, and then you could be secretary of a club, and you could be in charge of a budget that was bigger than the place where you worked on a machine. And a lot of people who became involved in the working men's club movement, they became the first working class politicians, councillors, MPs, all this kind of stuff. So it was a great emancipation of working class people as well. So there's a lot of different strands to it. And if I'm jumping around, that's because the whole thing is in my head at the moment. And there's so many different strands to it. And I'm trying to get it all into one coherent narrative, and it's proving a struggle.
No, you're the ace in the hole. I knew that you could talk the whole hour, and none of us would get bored. How about this? I think there are some clubs in like old America, like either PJ or Gerard. What about in those old mill towns? Aren't there things like Elks clubs or certain ethnic groups? Like I know in Boston, there's a Lithuanian Citizens Club. Do either one of you want to talk about those? Because I wonder if they're similar to what Pete's writing about.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that, especially here in Lowell. We have, because it's ethnic neighborhoods. So we have, the Portuguese club. It's still the Portuguese club. There's Elks. I think you started getting into it with, there was Knights of Columbus as we turned into. I'm trying to think. There was actually one here. It was almost like a speakeasy. You walked in. It was like a 1960s mafia movie. It was called the Sack Club, and it was the Social American Club. And you would literally had to press a buzzer to get in. Walked in. It was literally in the worst part of downtown, the Acre, the poorest section of downtown. You would walk in, push this button. You walked in, and you literally looked like you were walking into a casino movie. It was just crazy. And there was politicians all around a huge bar. And there was everybody who was anybody would be in this place. And it was all different times of day. It was just, I remember taking friends down there and they were like, are you buzzing in? I'm like, yeah, don't worry. But they'd walk in and they'd be scared because they didn't know what to expect. They still have those clubs. I think over time, I think they're starting to die out because that next generation is just, they're just not they're not passing on that generation. And hey, it is what it is. Everything's, I guess, dies in the end. But
that's a huge part of it. For 150 years, if you were, the legal drinking age over here is 18 rather than 21. And for your 18th birthday, your dad would give you your club membership card.
Yeah.
And that was it. You were following the family line. And around the time that I turned 18, that kind of thing stopped. My generation and every generation since don't want to be like your parents. They don't want to continue. They want to do something different. They want to strike out, do their own thing. And that's led to this massive decline in the clubs here. A lot of people in the UK think that clubs don't exist anymore because it's like, well, they're old fashioned. They belong to the 70s. They belong to my grandparents. So yeah, that happens here as well.
Hey, we'll be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Wisconsin, the state of cheese, makes half of the nation's specialty cheese and wins more awards than any other state or country. Our heritage and traditions, master cheesemaker program, and the American propensity for innovation all put Wisconsin on the cutting wedge of cheesemaking. With over 600 varieties of cheese to choose from and 5,500 national and international awards and counting, get ready to turn your refrigerator into a trophy case. Enjoying a Wisconsin cheese is basically like winning a gold medal in culinary achievement. Set your mind at cheese. When you bite into a wedge of Wisconsin Wonderful, you know it is made with the ultimate skill and passion possible. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. Become a member and support us at heritageradionetwork.org. All right, so we're talking with Pete and Gerard and PJ and BR about work and working people and Jack Kerouac. Gerard, you were just saying something?
Yeah, the parallel I want to draw to these clubs that both PJ and Pete are talking about is, and so, I grew up in a union family. My dad was an electrician. Every basically guy in my family, since they came to the United States, worked in the union shop. And I reported a story years ago of tugboat drivers in Baltimore, and it was about this idea of the kind of like drinking a raw egg and beer for breakfast. It was a very interesting thing, but it was a lot about, the relationship between beer and work, and like the idea that this beer is a source of nutrition, of value, where you kind of get together with all the people that work on the dock, work on the tugboat. You have a drink before you talk about everything to work. You come back. That's where you go back at the end of the day. You get nutrition for your hard day's work from your beer. Sometimes you put an egg to fortify in it. It's a different story. But I think that these clubs, to me, and that sort of kinship that you find in your union, your tradesmen, your fellow tradesmen who do the same thing, that becomes the definition of your life. If you look at areas of the United States on the East Coast, especially around Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, you have these towns built around factories, and all the people, when the factory whistle blows, where do they go? They go out to the tavern, and they all get together, and these are like union halls and that source of collectivity. And I think, Pete, you're absolutely right that as you kind of go, and the American dream is really to do better. Your parents want you to do better than they did. And so people lose connection to their blue collar roots. That was always my dad's line. Like he wanted me to not have to work these on-call shifts and, coming home with these injuries. And so I joined at 14, a non-union supermarket, and he called me a scab. But I was, 14 years old. I didn't want to pay dues. I just I wanted to be able to afford my car payment. So, I think that connection is definitely lost. And now you're at a point now where I think union membership is at an all-time low in the United States. Thankfully, it's making a comeback here in Minneapolis. We have the smallest union brewery in the country in Fair State Brewing Cooperative. So you're seeing a resurgence, but I think that, maybe these things are cyclical. Maybe they come and go as our relationship to labor changes over time.
Wow.
Well, I hope so. I mean, when you look at the recent kind of toxic culture and the Me Too that craft beer has had this year, with all these dreadful allegations coming out, some of that is down to genuinely unpleasant individuals in the beer industry, but a lot of it is down to just people not really knowing how to run a workplace, and people get working ridiculous shifts and having to kind of do 8-hour weeks and not get paid for it and this kind of thing. A lot like just besides, it's like join a union. And in the UK, on that side of things, I think for kind of people working craft breweries, people working in bottle shops and beer bars, just being some, well, join a union. A union is here to help you sort this kind of stuff out. And I'm betraying my working class socialist roots here. But yeah, I do think a rise in unions again is the answer.
You know, I did think last year with all the talk of like just what was going on in breweries and restaurants and other jobs, it seems like that is the answer, that HR is part of it, that a lot of businesses have grown so fast that, you know, you maybe you only knew how to manage as a mom and pop. And suddenly once you get to 15 or 20 employees, your relationship changes with your employees. And, you know, that's an interesting, we could have another conversation about unions. And that could be very cool. I want to ask BR, because BR, what's your take on this? Is there a question you want to ask someone on the panel here? Because I always respect your opinion.
Well, no, I just think it's rather interesting in terms of the clubs. I mean, even when you think of, you know, the start of Manhattan and New Amsterdam, where the original city hall started as a tavern. It was initially a tavern. And because they didn't want to entertain, the governor didn't want to entertain in his own home. But then it became a meeting place. And while it wasn't so much working class, it was more on the political level where, you know, people would come, politicians would come, and it was people getting together. They were getting the news, what was happening. And then I think that just kind of evolved in New York in particular, where you did have political clubs that would meet in taverns, depending on which party you were in. You went to different taverns. And then eventually you see that in, you know, the Lower East Side when, you know, in the 1800s, where tenement buildings, people had no place to go. They were, you know, living on top of each other in these tiny, tiny buildings in basements. And well, mostly just the men would go out though, because it didn't really have a living room or a place to socialize. They'd go to the bars, and that's where they'd go there for lunch. They'd go there for dinner. They'd go there for drinks. Some of them, the gin palaces, as Pete was referencing earlier, you know, was more of a place of oblivion. But there were plenty of bars. I mean, there were like thousands and thousands of bars, you know, lining the streets downtown, where people would just go and socialize, or the men would go and socialize for the most part. And made it into, you know, I think they also had it where some, if you were working in, you know, textiles, if you were working, you know, and on the docks, each neighborhood, each industry kind of had its own place to go. So in a similar sort of microcosm, New York is similar to the, you know, working class that you see, you know, whether it's the mill towns, the factory towns, you know, all up the Eastern Seaboard and in England as well. But I found it fascinating though, because I didn't know about that there were actual clubs, but in England, that seems like it also sort of a precursor to the unions. Would there be a lot of union organizing within those working men's clubs?
Well, it was really interesting. I've been exploring that relationship because a lot of what we see about how working class people got basic rights, we see that played out in the workspace, and most cultural historians, most social historians talk about how we got rights at work, and the working men's clubs were about leisure. They were about what you did on the few brief hours you had between sleep and going back to work again, or between work and sleep. And there was a close relationship between working trades unions and the club movement, but the club movement had this flirtation with radical politics. A lot of the radical clubs in London, who had really dangerous subversive ideas, such as allowing women to have the vote and things like that. They threatened to take over the club movement at one point, but the club movement said, no, this is about what you do in your downtime. This is about your leisure time. So a lot of these people may well have been involved in politics. They may well have become councillors and politicians and union representatives. A lot of them were. But the club kind of marked out its space as, we don't really talk about that kind of stuff in here. You do that in the other place. Here, we just sit and we have a beer and we relax and we play a game of dominoes or cards or snooker or whatever.
Hey, Gerard, we're going to wrap up soon, but I'd like to go back to that line about the beer glow versus the whiskey drunk. What was it about Kerouac that made him go over the edge? Was it because he was from a working background and what about his other beat writers? The contemporaries around him were also doing drugs and partying, and why did he go downhill so fast?
I think the immediate thing that Kerouac realized once he got to Columbia, now Kerouac went to Columbia on a football scholarship, right? And he had worked his way out of this, really industrial situation via his skills playing football. And that's how he got to Columbia. The people that he was meeting when he was at Columbia were people that had trust funds, people that, were exploring the arts in a way that most working class people can't do. And so at first, I think he was very excited by this idea and these sort of philosophical pursuits he was having, these incredible benzodrine fueled conversations he was having with Allen Ginsberg and this plumbing of the mind. But there was always a division in that he was from a different place. And he was from an immigrant family. He had learned how to speak English at 6 years old. Meanwhile, he's meeting these people who have had this incredible privileged background, and they were, these great families of great repute, and the sort of folks that you sort of typically associate with academia. And I think at some point it fell apart. And, I think you look at his relationship with Ginsberg too. Ginsberg was essentially at some point Kerouac's soulmate, and they were in love to some extent. Depends on how much Jack really wants to admit it. By the end of his life, they weren't talking to one another. He was attacking Ginsberg all the time. And I think it was because he at some point thought, I'm not part of this. I'm the guy who drinks beer. I'm the Ballantine guy. These people they're doing psychedelic drugs and they're plumbing the depths of consciousness. I really just want to relax and have a good time. And he resented everything that came out of it. So I think Kerouac's class background was really the dividing point. And, eventually you see it had turned malignant, and he became this virile racist and, a person who was just generally not pleasant to be around. But I think it comes out of that background. It comes out of, he got in where the drugs and the alcohol were helping him, and then it metastasized and it made him into a very terrible person, because he wasn't doing it for any depth or intellectual pursuit. It was always that sort of alleviation of the worldly pressures, not understanding deeper the human experience, trying to run away from the human experience.
Wow. Do you think he would have been happier if he never was famous?
Well, he intellectually could not deal with the pressure. He did. I think, his tragedy is that he was simultaneously too famous for his own good and also not famous enough. He never received any recognition, never won any major awards until after his death. And he was, very upset about that. Meanwhile, he was getting recognition, and he felt that people were taking the wrong message from his writing as well. And that, this is something that with Lowell celebrates Kerouac as a point of contention, is he didn't want people to take on this sort of like beatnik, run down the road, abandon your responsibilities lifestyle. It's not what he ever wanted. It's not what he wanted to be known for. And it just kind of ran away from him. And all of a sudden he found himself, this was the time where television was really becoming an emerging medium, and authors were famous for like the first time ever. And he became the face of a generation. He never asked for that. He didn't want to be that. He just wanted to write the stuff. He had to fight for 8 years to get On the Road published. Because it was so out there, and he was never accepted, and he was fighting against this world that didn't accept him. And then when people did accept him, it was in a way that he disagreed with, and so he revolted against that. It was that sort of push and pull. He never really made it in the way that he wanted to.
You think if he had stayed in Lowell, he might have been okay? Because I again, going from working town to New York alone is quite a journey.
I mean, clearly there was something there, right? And I think why do Americans find Jack Kerouac to be such like a cathartic read, and why do they find that resonance with it? And I think it's because of so many people go that route, where they go from this, sheltered, maybe singular context of your youth and adolescence, and you go out into the larger world. That's what he represented to everyone. So I think it was, ultimately very important. I can't say what would make him happy. I mean, I know his benediction for the working class, how much he loved the working class. It really defined him. I don't know if he would have been happier, doing that, working in a mill and getting laid off. And, I think he was probably doomed to have a pretty miserable existence just by who he was. but at least he was able to turn that into a really positive literary contribution at the end of the day.
Well, Jory, I want to thank you and your editors for letting you write about Jack Kerouac and good beer hunting. That was a really cool, stimulating article. We got to meet
Thank you so much.
This whole crew. PJ, anything else you want to say about Navigation Brewing and Lowell? What should I drink? I'm coming off a shift, whether I was lawn mowing or working in the kitchen, which I've done many times. I want a good cold one. What should I get at Navigation Brewing?
It's all going to depend on what week you get down here. If you get down here in the next couple, I would say definitely the Kolsch. If not that, I would go straight to probably one of the pale ales we've got going on right now. We got a couple of West Coast low ABV pale ales. Great. And BR, if you didn't say it already, what's your working class beer?
Well, right now I'm drinking a transmitter. It's the BNY1, pre-prohibition Pilsner that they actually brewed in honor of the men and women working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard since for many, many years. And, it's the beer that would have been, for the most part, drunk, in the late 1800s, early 1900s before Prohibition. Thirst quenching, yet refreshing, not too heavy, but with a nice mouthfeel, some body to it, a little bit of crispness from the hops, and a little bit more body from the corn, from the maize.
And then back then, BR, did they have stainless steel back then? Were they brewing in stainless steel or wood? Do you know?
It depends on how far back. I'm not sure when stainless was first introduced. I mean, in terms of that would probably, I would imagine, be in the 1900s when that was used on a larger basis. It would have been cast iron, it would have been copper, would have been wood. But these are the pre-prohibition lagers are the ones that the German immigrants were brewing. They had to use the corn or the flake maize to lighten up the American. The 6-row barley was a little bit more difficult in terms of its protein. It was harder to make a more clear beer, and they found that the corn added to it sort of was able to lighten it up, but as well as the proteins in the American barley at the time were able to ferment more sugars out of the corn. So it wasn't, most people think of corn as a cheap adjunct that the major brewers use now to cut costs, but it actually started out as something that was necessary to make a better beer with the ingredients that were grown in the U.S. To make something similar to what the Germans and the Czech brewers, Bohemian brewers would be brewing, what they had, back in Europe, trying to recreate something similar given the ingredients they had on hand here. Although often with imported hops.
Wow, I want to go get one of your transmitters right now.
The S9, that S9 stays on. Oh, it's so good. Love transmitter.
Oh yeah, S9. And Pete, what's your working class beer?
It would have to be porter, I guess. It was the first industrial revolution beer, the first beer to be brewed on industrial scale. Allegedly invented about a mile away from where I'm sitting right now. And it was, people talk about drinking beer today. When you look at the volumes of porter that were being brewed in London in the early 19th century, we were swimming in the stuff, we really, really were. So we drink far, far less now than we were then. And it's interesting when people say, we hear a lot from kind of mainstream multinational brewers, but people don't like difficult tastes, they don't like complexity, they don't like flavor. And when you taste a decent porter and you think, when this was the main beer in the world, people were drinking way more per head than they are now of cheap industrial lagers. So maybe there is a kind of mass acceptance of interesting flavorful beers.
Yeah, a friend of mine he's from a mine town in Scotland, and he grew up in England, and he always tries to find a porter in New York for lunch. Do you have a porter that you recommend, even if it's only over there?
Yeah, I mean, quite a few. There's a brewery started up just up the road from me, Redemption. And this is a guy who used to work as a hedge fund manager, and he quits that job and opens a brewery and calls it Redemption. I mean, you figure out his motivation there. And his porter, the Redemption porter, is just I don't want to get into. I try not to get into the kind of the exactitudes of, is this an authentic 18th century recipe and that kind of thing, because the ingredients are different. You couldn't brew an 18th century porter now because hops are different and barley's different and the water's different. But I like to imagine when I drink a pint of that I'm drinking what people drank here in this house. My house is 150 years old. I like to imagine that when I'm drinking that, it's what people were drinking in this house 150 years ago.
All right. And Gerard, what's your working beer? I know you told us about a couple that you had.
Yeah, I Castle Danger Cream Ale. That's the one I drink. I love cream ales. Actually, I worked with a Scottish guy, and he had no idea what a cream ale was. So I love the fact that it is pretty quintessentially American, and it comes from a little town up north in Minnesota. And let me tell you, it hits the spot every single time.
Well, what's the name of the brewery again?
Castle Danger.
Castle Danger. Wow. Guys, it's been really great fun. Thanks so much for joining me. I got PJ, BR, Pete, and Gerard, and really, really special talk. I love talking with Pete Brown, and any excuse to getting him on is always a pleasure. Looking forward to seeing your book, Clubland, coming out 2022. And Gerard Fagenberg, bro, I'm going to keep following you on Good Beer Hunting and many other things. And thanks so much. And I'm going to get to Lowell, Massachusetts.
Yes.
Navigation Brewing with PJ and BR. Looking forward to having a transmitter with you very soon. So, guys, thanks so much. Thanks to Armin, our engineer, for pulling this together. And we'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. All right. Thank you, guys.
Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like. Tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks.
Hey there, I'm Lee Ullman here with some big news from the National Young Farmers Coalition. We're partnering with Heritage Radio Network on a special season of The Farm Report. It's all about what's happening with the Farm Bill and how it impacts farmers and eaters.
I am growing diversified vegetables on land that's been in our family for 150 years.
And so with the pandemic, gentrification, property values going up, we had to sell the land and we lost it.
Join us as we uncover the untold stories behind this massive piece of legislation that shapes how we grow our food, what we eat, and so much more.
The problems we have had, those are things that come from earlier Farm Bill and USDA policy, right? Like Earl Butts, get big or get out.
It's my responsibility to know not only what I'm eating, but then like how that all came to be, and realize like, wow, like this piece of legislation, all this money, like it's technically something that I support as a taxpayer.
While Congress debates the next Farm Bill, this is not just an invitation to listen. It's a call to action. Be part of the conversation. Subscribe to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Listening.